now for babies and toddlers separated from their parents at the border. More than 2,000 undocumented children have been separated from their parents since early May. Joining us now to talk about what can be done is Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Allison. What can be done is very simple.
What is it?
President Trump can reverse this policy decision that he's made.
Yep.
He can stop misleading the American people by suggesting that this somehow is the responsibility of Democrats or it's required by law. Neither of those are true.
Yes.
A dozen Republican senators have now said that President Trump can change this policy today.
That is a fact.
Mr. President, if you're watching, you can change this today. It doesn't require legislation. You are not compelled to do this by law. Faith leaders across every major faith have been denouncing this, most recently Pope Francis. This is inhumane and cruel to use children as pawns in our long-running disagreements about how to secure our borders and fix our broken immigration system.
Senator, those are facts that you've just stated. This is a policy. It is a new policy. It was concocted by the Trump administration. He could change it today with a phone call. However,
Correct.
For whatever reason, the president's heart is hardened to these children. And so it falls to people with a conscience. What can Congress do? You cannot rely on the president. He's not going to do anything he doesn't want to. So what can Congress do? What can legislation do today to fix this?
Well, given the mess at the Republican caucus meeting over on the House side last night with President Trump, given my own experience with trying to craft bipartisan legislation earlier this year, I'll remind you that one of our biggest challenges is that President Trump and his real position, what legislation he'd be willing to sign or support, is a constantly moving point. As a candidate from literally the day he entered the race for president, he has been the hardest of hardliners on immigration, describing folks who come to our country from Mexico in the most unflattering and negative terms possible. So it's pretty hard to know what we could possibly do to either address the problem he created by reversing the policy allowing dreamers to stay in this country, or with this new heartless and cruel policy towards children.
Okay.
It's hard to know what we can do when he's a moving point.
He said, I think, yesterday from the reporting that happened inside that meeting, that he would basically sign any bill that showed up on his desk. He told the Republicans, either one of them, the the so-called compromise bill or the more hardline one. So we just had Congressman Jeff Denham on, who said that you all should get on board with their the Republicans' so-called compromise bill, because it's basically the same as what the Gang of Eight bill was in 2008. Would you be willing to compromise on that bill?
First, I believe that to be a mischaracterization of all the elements of that bill. And the Gang of Eight bill I think you're referring to is the one from 2013 that passed the Senate while I was here.
Okay.
They are talking about a significantly different package that is far more to the right, is closer to the package that only got 39 votes here in the Senate. It was the one championed by Secretary Nielsen of Homeland Security and President Trump. You may recall we had 4 different bills on the floor of the Senate for a vote. I was the co-sponsor of one of them with Senator McCain of Arizona. I worked hard with a bipartisan group led by Senator Susan Collins of Maine. That one got 54 votes. The only one that got 60 votes was the president's. It got 60 no votes, and that was the farthest right. It did a whole series of changes to our immigration policy. Here's what I resent, Allison, is that this change in policy announced by this administration is being used to create a crisis and is being used for the president to try and get his border wall and some very far rightward moves in our immigration policy. I think it's inhumane to use children as bargaining chips.
Agreed. Everybody agrees with you, okay? But that's where we are. And so if the Democrats have to cave on the border wall, I know that that would require holding your nose and that seems so
Allison,
counter to what you want. But in order to help the kids.
Allison, the bill that I co-sponsored did that. It actually, in exchange for a pathway to citizenship for 1.3 million dreamers, provided $25 billion in funding for border security, including a wall system. That was taken up and voted on the floor of the Senate. And we thought it was going to pass until that day when President Trump and Secretary Nielsen began aggressively, personally lobbying against it and peeled off several of our Republican likely supporters. That's what I'm speaking about. We thought we had a deal that would get administration support until it got to the floor. And frankly, it is hard to keep negotiating negotiating with folks who keep moving the goalposts farther and farther right and engaging in practices that are taking America and dragging us through the mud worldwide and destroying our reputation as a humane country in order to accomplish these goals.
I hear your frustration. You're making your case in a very compelling way. But then you have Senator Chuck Schumer say, we're not going to deal with legislation anymore. I mean, he seems to have gotten to the point where he doesn't think that legislation, your silver bullet, will work. But then you're just helpless. If you're not going to try to work with the other side, and Senator Schumer says that he's just sort of given up on legislation, then what do you tell these kids?
Okay, so I have continued, after that debacle on the floor now several months ago, I have continued to meet with and attempt to negotiate with Republican colleagues. Allison, you know me. I'm someone who works tirelessly across the aisle, who tries to move bipartisan legislation. I've continued conversations about how we could make progress on addressing hundreds of thousands of folks under temporary protected status, for example, who are facing deportation, how to resolve the Dreamer issue, how to resolve some of these larger issues. But this newly created crisis, by changing the policy on separating families who cross our border, to me is just, it is really hard to swallow the idea that somehow this is my responsibility, Democrats' responsibility, to come even farther President Trump's way because of the cruel way children are being treated. The solutions being put forward by Republican senators this week would instead incarcerate in pretrial detention whole families in facilities that are not yet built, with immigration judges that will take months, if not years, to fully hire, and in pursuit of a shortened asylum process, just 2 weeks, that as someone who handled a few asylum cases as a lawyer in private practice, I will tell you, it's exceptionally hard to put on a successful, competent asylum case in just 2 weeks. The basic outlines of what Republicans are proposing would result in mass incarceration of children in pretrial detention, something that has not been embraced by either party in a long time.
Senator Chris Coons, we really appreciate you spelling out so clearly your position on this. It's really helpful to talk to you.
Thank you, Allison.
John.
It was fascinating, and there you see